Nonfiction and poetry has appeared in Poetry Quarterly, Bazaar, Leaf Green Garden Press, and The End of Austin, among other publications. She has a master's in Hispanic Literatures from the University of Texas at Austin and has continued to engage with Latin American creative works through her poetry and film script translations. Her translation of the Brazilian poet Coxe Evaristo is forthcoming in the anthology of Latin American Poetry of Resistance. Please help me welcome Megan.
All right, thanks, Kirk. So this selection is part of a larger project, a novel about a family's history, much of which takes place in Argentina. This section follows a young woman named Isabella as she comes from Genoa to Buenos Aires as a naive young immigrant. So shortly after she arrives, she joins a brothel, and these scenes in particular take place on November 20th, 1918, where she is returning to the immigrant-heavy neighborhood of La Boca to get a new dress made. When they arrive in La Boca, no one on the street seemed to notice the heat that radiated in every direction. Between the blues, yellows, and reds of the tin houses, people buzzed like flies, perspiration running down their faces as they fanned themselves, but nothing slowed. Potatoes, onions, peppers, and bloody cuts of beef traded hands as housewives and maids moved on to make the midday meal. Isabella couldn't remember on which street the seamstress's shop was located. Was it the first left after the blue and green house with the yellow awning? Or was it the second right and then a left at the orange market with the plump tomatoes? Gianna and Angelina were a few steps behind her, so she turned the corner at the tomatoes and stared down the street. Nothing seemed familiar to her amid the flurry of people. She looked back to see where her companions were, but a woman in the fruit market caught her eye. She looked ancient, with dark, wrinkled skin like leather, and she was wrapped in a thick shawl. Her eyes were as dark as the sea had been while crossing the ocean at night. She smiled towards Isabella. "Isa, don't stare at the savage. She might curse you," Gianna whispered when she caught up. "What do you mean?" Isabella asked. "That's an old Indian woman, probably a witch. Besides, where are you going? Carla's shop is the other way." Gianna pointed left, down a street Isabella hadn't remembered at all. She thought for a second about what Gianna had meant about the old brown-skinned woman. She had learned of Indians back in Rome and of the cruel deeds they had done to earlier immigrants. But that was long ago. And besides, they didn't live in cities, even if they still existed. Gia, she was smiling. Gianna laughed. "Piccola, that probably means she already cursed you. Be careful." And then she poked Isabella's side with her fingers and began to spin around, waving her hands as if she was cursing Isabella herself. Angelina joined them, mimicking Gianna's frantic motions. Isabella eventually left too, and she pretended to dodge the spells as they were trying to cast. They looped around one another as they walked toward the main street, crisscrossing their steps to dodge curses. By the time they stopped, Isabella had completely forgotten about the woman's kind smile. Instead, their senses were consumed by the shopkeepers on either side of the street, shouting louder, vying for their attention. "Verduras! Carne! Pan y dulces!" The women turned their heads back and forth as if watching a game of badminton, the shuttlecock hopping back and forth between two rackets. She could make out a word here and there in Spanish, and her guess was confirmed or found wrong as the vendors would hold up a pear, a zucchini, or pointed to their freshly baked baguette. She was overwhelmed by the smells, which swung between the sweet, yeasty scent of baking dough and the sour odor of fermenting fruit. There were so many stalls that she was growing dizzy, as if she were back in the rocking ship crossing the Atlantic once more. It wasn't until Angelina took her hand and tugged that she began to move again, toddling almost like a small child. They finally took a left off the market street, and Isabella recognized the seamstress's shop further down on the right side, with a narrow sunbeam spreading across the entrance. They entered and stood huddled together near the door, as if they were waiting for permission to go any further. Carla did not look up and remained seated at her small table with the one, slightly shorter leg which wobbled as she leaned against it. "I wish you wouldn't come in droves like you do. It's not very encouraging for my other customers," Carla said. Isabella wondered how she knew who they were without looking first. She inhaled and felt the dust particles gather in her throat and tickle. The shop was more cluttered than the last time she had been here. Fabrics and clothing accumulating in piles throughout the store. Carla's hair, which was all she could see of her head, was pulled back in a haphazard bun, as if she had rolled out of her bed and into her chair without stopping first at a mirror. "We are paying customers," Angelina said, her nostrils flared. Isabella was surprised at her demanding tone and was frozen, waiting to see what happened next. Carla began to raise her head and open her mouth, but before she could say anything, Gianna added, "We're here to pick up Senora Riojas' order." "Of course you are," Carla said, her expression flat. "But it's not ready. Tell her I need another day. Actually, 2, as tomorrow is Sunday." At this point, Isabella was ready to run out of the shop and back into the chaos of the street. She did not want to cause trouble. She had promised herself after leaving quarantine at the immigrant hotel without permission that she would live quietly for now. But the scene also began to remind her of how her mother used to be on particularly busy days in the shop in Genoa. Like Carla, she would be disheveled, each hour more and more like the Singari vagrants that came into town to beg during the day, but slept in camps in the outskirts at night. Isabella would tiptoe around her mother on those days, yet somehow she still seemed to end up punished. When her mother's pupils grew wide and dark, Isabella knew there was a scolding coming. Now she thought of Angelina was in for a similar fate. Or worse, they would be banished and Isabella would never get the dress she had been wanting since she had seen it in the window in Rome. Thank you.